My son said, sign the house to us or go to a nursing home, so I called my lawyer first, then he read the will. The air in my own kitchen had turned foreign. It used to smell of my late husband Arthur's pipe tobacco, of simmering Sunday gravy, and of the lemon polish I used on the oak table he'd built with his own hands. Now it smelled of entitlement, a metallic, sterile scent that clung to the new stainless steel appliances my son, Ethan, and his wife, Brenda, had installed without asking. My name is Eleanor Vance, and I was being gently, politely, and systematically erased from my own life. The ultimatum was delivered on a Tuesday morning over a cup of lukewarm tea I hadn't been allowed to make for myself. Brenda believed my old copper kettle was a fire hazard. "The handle is loose, Eleanor," she declared 3 months ago, her voice carrying that particular tone of manufactured concern. "We can't have you burning the house down." The kettle had been a wedding gift from Arthur's mother. It had never once failed me in 47 years, but now it sat banished in the basement, replaced by some chrome monstrosity that whistled like a dying bird. "Mom," Ethan began, his voice laced with the strained patience of a man trying to reason with a child. He wouldn't look at me, focusing instead on a spot on the wall just over my head where a family photo used to hang before Brenda declared it too cluttered for her minimalist aesthetic. He had his father's hands, but none of his courage. Those same hands that had once helped Arthur build the deck out back, that had carved his initials into the old maple tree in the yard when he was 12, now fidgeted nervously with his coffee cup, unable to meet his own mother's eyes. "We need to talk about the future," he continued, and I could hear the rehearsed quality of his words as if he'd practiced this speech in the mirror. Brenda, ever the pragmatist, placed a sheaf of glossy papers on the table between us with the precision of a chess player making a decisive move. The top page featured a picture of a smiling, silver-haired woman waving from the manicured lawn of a place called Willow Creek Assisted Living. The woman in the photo looked nothing like me. Her smile was vacant, her eyes empty of any real life or spark. "We've been thinking, Eleanor," Brenda said, using that tone she probably reserved for underperforming employees at her marketing firm, the one that suggested she was doing you a tremendous favor by even acknowledging your existence. "This house is too much for you, the stairs, the maintenance. It's a liability, we're worried." Worried, that was the word they used to disguise their greed. They'd been worried when they moved in 6 months ago, claiming it was temporary while they looked for their own place. They'd been worried when they started rearranging the furniture, replacing my comfortable floral sofa with something angular and uncomfortable that Brenda called contemporary. They'd been worried when they painted over the warm yellow walls Arthur and I had chosen together, covering them with cold gray that made the house feel like a medical facility. "The truth is," Brenda continued, her perfectly manicured nail tapping against the brochure with each word, "we think it's time you transition to a place where you can be properly cared for, somewhere with medical staff, structured activities, people your own age. But these places are expensive, Eleanor, very expensive. The only way to afford it is to leverage the asset." "The asset?" I repeated quietly, my voice barely audible. She was talking about my home. The home Arthur and I bought in 1978 with a down payment we saved by eating beans on toast for 3 years and driving a car held together with prayer and duct tape. The home where we raised Ethan, where his height is still marked in pencil on the laundry room doorframe, each measurement dated and celebrated like a small miracle. I could see Arthur's ghost in every corner of this room. There, by the window, was where he'd stood every morning in his robe, coffee in hand, watching the sunrise and planning his day. The small burn mark on the counter where he'd once set down a hot pan too quickly, cursing under his breath while I laughed at his clumsiness. The slight depression in the floorboards where his workshop chair used to sit when he'd bring his smaller projects inside during winter, filling the kitchen with the warm scent of wood shavings and honest work. "So, we have a solution that works for everyone," Ethan finally chimed in, finding his script again. His voice had that hollow quality of someone reciting lines they didn't quite believe in. you sign the house over to us. We'll take on the burden of its upkeep, and in exchange, we'll make sure your expenses at Willow Creek are covered. It's the only logical path forward, Mom, really, it is." I looked from his face to Brenda's. They were a team, a united front of calm, rational cruelty. Brenda's smile never wavered, but there was something predatory in her eyes, like a cat watching a wounded bird. Ethan at least had the decency to look uncomfortable, but not uncomfortable enough to stop what was happening. "And if I don't want to go to Willow Creek?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The question hung in the air like smoke from Arthur's old pipe. "If I want to stay in my own home." The silence stretched between us. I could hear the new refrigerator humming, that expensive stainless steel monster that had replaced my old white one without consultation. The old one had worked perfectly fine, but it had ruined the sight lines, according to Brenda. Brenda's smile didn't waver, but her eyes went cold as winter stone. "Then we can't be responsible for you, Eleanor. We have our own lives, our own future to build. We can't be your caretakers forever. It will be the nursing home then, the state-run one on Meridian Street, you know the one. And they will take the house to pay for it anyway. This way, at least it stays in the family, at least something good comes of it." The threat hung in the air, polished and sharp as a surgeon's blade. "Sign it over, or we will have you declared incompetent and lose it all anyway." I had driven past that state facility once. The parking lot was cracked and weedy, the building itself a monument to bureaucratic indifference. The residents I'd glimpsed through the windows looked like ghosts, pale and forgotten, staring at nothing. The thought of ending my days there, surrounded by strangers who saw me as just another body to warehouse, made my chest tight with something between panic and rage. But I didn't let them see that fear. Instead, I nodded slowly, as if considering their generous offer. "You've given me a lot to think about," I said, my voice meek and wavering, the voice of a confused old woman who knew she was beaten. "I'll need a day or two to process all this." They exchanged a look of triumph. I could practically see the dollar signs dancing in their eyes. The deal was done. The old woman would fold just as they'd planned. Ethan's shoulders relaxed for the first time since he'd walked into the kitchen. Brenda gathered up her brochures with the satisfied air of someone who just closed a particularly lucrative sale. "Of course, Eleanor," Brenda said, her voice now warm with false sympathy. "Take all the time you need. We know this is a big decision. But really, once you see Willow Creek, I think you'll find it's exactly what you need. They have craft classes, bridge tournaments, even a small library." A library? As if I hadn't spent 40 years building my own collection of books, each one carefully chosen and loved. As if my leather-bound volumes of poetry and my collection of gardening magazines were just more clutter to be discarded in their rush to sanitize my life. After they left for work, Brenda clicking importantly on her high heels, Ethan shuffling behind her like a reluctant shadow, I didn't go to my room to cry as they probably expected. I didn't call my sister Martha to sob about my ungrateful son. I didn't even sit at the kitchen table and stare at those glossy brochures with their lies about golden years and assisted living. Instead, I went to the whole closet, to the false panel at the back that Arthur had built 40 years ago during his paranoid phase after the factory layoffs. "Every man needs a place to keep his important papers safe," he'd said, installing the hidden compartment with the same meticulous care he brought to all his projects. Behind the panel was a small, fireproof safe, its combination burned into my memory like a prayer, our wedding date. Inside was a folder containing our original deed, yellowed with age but still legal. Our mortgage burning certificate from 1996, when we'd made that final payment and celebrated with champagne that cost more than our weekly grocery budget. And beneath those, wrapped in oilcloth, was a slim, leather-bound journal. This was Arthur's real ledger, his book of accounts, not the checkbook register I'd shown the accountant every year, but something else entirely. A record of disappointments meticulously documented in his careful carpenter's handwriting. Arthur had never been a man to raise his voice or make scenes. When Ethan had disappointed him, he'd simply nodded, made a note, and moved on. But he'd remembered everything. Every broken promise, every casual betrayal, every moment our son had chosen the easy path over the right one. For years, whenever Ethan had borrowed money and promised to pay it back, Arthur had recorded it, not with anger but with a quiet, sorrowful precision that broke my heart to read. May 15, 1998, $5,000 for seed money for a web design company. Ethan says it's a sure thing that he'll have us paid back within 6 months with interest. The company name is Digital Dreams LLC. Note, asked for business plan. Ethan said he'd bring it by next week. He never did. October 3, 2003, $12,000 to cover gambling debts. Ethan swears on his mother's grave it's a one-time mistake, that he's learned his lesson. He cried when he asked. Eleanor cried when she heard. I wrote the check. Note, made him promise to get help. He promised. I looked up Gamblers Anonymous meetings in the area and left the information on his kitchen counter. He threw it away. June 22, 2009, $40,000 down payment for his first condo. Ethan calls it an advance on his inheritance. Says he'll pay us back when he sells his old apartment. The apartment sells 3 months later. We never see a dime. Note, the condo is in Brenda's name only. When I mention this to Ethan, he says it's for tax purposes. I don't understand tax purposes, but I understand lies. Page after page of careful documentation. The total with interest Arthur had calculated at a modest 3% was just over $254,000, a fortune to us, a lifetime of trust betrayed one loan at a time. But that wasn't the most devastating document in the safe. Beneath the ledger, sealed in a manila envelope marked for Eleanor's eyes only, was Arthur's last will and testament. Not the simple document we'd shown Ethan, the standard boilerplate affair that left everything to the surviving spouse. This was different. This was Arthur's masterpiece, his final act of love and justice combined. A document no one but me and our lawyer, Frank McMillan, had ever seen. A document that contained a single, brutal clause Arthur had insisted on adding in the final months of his life, when the cancer was eating him alive but his mind remained sharp as a blade. I remembered the day he dictated it to Frank, his voice weak but determined. I won't let him destroy Eleanor the way he's destroyed everything else, he'd whispered. If he wants what I've built, he'll have to prove he deserves it, and if he can't, Arthur's smile had been sad but resolute. Then at least something good will come from all this pain. My first call was to Frank. He was in his 70s now, semi-retired but still practicing from a small office above the hardware store on Main Street. His voice was exactly as I remembered it, steady, professional, tinged with the slight accent of someone who'd grown up speaking Polish at home. Frank, I said, it's time. There was a pause on the other end, the sound of papers rustling. Are you sure, Eleanor? Once you set this in motion, there's no going back, no second chances, no family reconciliation. Are you prepared for that? They've given me an ultimatum, I said, my voice stronger than it had been in months. Sign over the house or be put in a state-run home. They've made the choice for me. The anger in Frank's voice was palpable, a low growl that reminded me why Arthur had always said Frank would have made a good union representative. Those ungrateful, I'm sorry, Eleanor, Arthur was my friend. This is not what he would have wanted for you. I'll be there at 9 a.m. tomorrow. Have them both present, and Eleanor, pack a bag. You won't want to stay in that house after this. I spent that evening preparing, not packing, not yet, but putting things in order. I took down the few photographs Brenda hadn't already relocated, holding each one for a moment before wrapping it carefully in tissue paper. Arthur's favorite coffee mug, the one with the faded "World's Greatest Dad" text that Ethan had given him for Father's Day when he was 8 and still believed his father hung the moon. My mother's pearl brooch, the one I'd worn to my wedding and to Ethan's graduation and to every important moment in between. The next morning, I told Ethan and Brenda that my lawyer was coming over to help me with the paperwork for the house transfer. The lie came easier than I'd expected. They were delighted, practically vibrating with excitement at the prospect of their swift victory. Brenda even prepared a tray of store-bought croissants and coffee for the meeting, as if we were celebrating rather than planning my exile. "I'm so proud of you for making this decision, Mom," Ethan said, and for a moment I almost believed he meant it. "I know it's hard, but it's really for the best. You'll see, Willow Creek is going to be perfect for you." Perfect? As if there could be anything perfect about being warehoused away from everything I'd ever loved, everything Arthur and I had built together. Frank McMillan arrived precisely at 9, just as the grandfather clock in the hallway was chiming the hour. He didn't look like an instrument of justice. He looked like a retired history professor with his worn tweed jacket, kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and a gentle demeanor that put people at ease. His briefcase was battered leather held together with brass clasps that had gone green with age. He sat at Arthur's oak table, the table my husband had spent a year building in the basement workshop, carrying it upstairs piece by carefully sanded piece. The table where we'd eaten thousands of meals, where I'd helped Ethan with his homework, where Arthur had taught him to play chess on rainy Sunday afternoons. Ethan and Brenda sat opposite, barely containing their glee. Brenda had even put on her best jewelry for the occasion, as if she were attending a coronation. Ethan kept checking his watch, probably calculating how quickly they could get to the bank after the signing was done. "Thank you for coming on such short notice, Frank," Brenda said with a saccharine smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We just want to make this transition as smooth as possible for Eleanor. Family is so important, don't you think?" Family, the word tasted like ashes in my mouth. Frank nodded slowly, his eyes scanning the room with the careful attention of someone taking inventory. He lingered on the bare walls where family photos used to hang, on the empty spaces where Arthur's handmade shelves had been removed and replaced with modern floating shelves that held nothing but decorative objects with no history, no meaning. "Of course," Frank said, his voice measured and calm. "Arthur was a dear friend. I promised him on his deathbed that I would always be here to see his wishes are carried out. A promise is a sacred thing, don't you think?" Something in his tone made Ethan shift uncomfortably, but Brenda was too focused on the prize to notice the subtle warning. Frank opened his briefcase with deliberate slowness, the brass clasps making soft clicking sounds in the quiet room. Ethan leaned forward, ready to sign whatever papers would make him rich. "Before we discuss the transfer of this property," Frank began, pulling out a thick manila folder, "there is another matter we must attend to. As you know, Arthur passed away 2 years ago, however his final will and testament has never been formally read to his heir. This was at Arthur's specific request." Ethan looked confused, his confidence wavering slightly. "But, I'm his heir, we know what's in the will, Mom showed us the copy. The house, the savings account, it all goes to Mom and then to me when she—" He couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't say the words out loud. "Not exactly," Frank said, his voice taking on the formal tone of legal proceedings. He pulled out a sealed, cream-colored envelope, the kind used for important documents. The wax seal was unbroken, bearing the impression of Arthur's signet ring, the one with the intertwined roses he'd worn for 40 years. Arthur was a very specific man, as you know. He left very specific instructions about when and how this will was to be executed. He stipulated that the document was not to be read until the day you, Ethan, formally requested ownership or control of this house. By making your ultimatum yesterday, by demanding that Eleanor sign over the property, you have triggered the execution of the will. The blood drained from Ethan's face like water from a broken pipe. He looked suddenly young and frightened, like the little boy who used to run to Arthur when thunder scared him during summer storms. Brenda's smile froze into a plastic rictus of dawning horror. "I don't understand," she said, her voice higher than usual. "What does that mean? What kind of will has conditions?" Frank broke the seal with theatrical precision, the wax cracking like a gunshot in the silent room. The papers inside were thick, expensive stock, the kind Arthur would have chosen for something this important. "I, Arthur Vance, being of sound mind and body," Frank began, his voice taking on the cadence of formal legal language. He read through the standard preamble, the witness statements, the notarizations that made it all legal and binding. He detailed the small bequests, Arthur's tools to the local trade school where he'd taught night classes, a donation to the animal shelter where we'd adopted our beloved dog Max. To my beloved wife, Eleanor, Frank continued, I leave my undying love and the entirety of my liquid assets, stocks, and bonds for her to use as she sees fit for the remainder of her natural life. She has been my partner, my rock, and the co-builder of everything good in my life. She deserves security and comfort, and I pray she finds both. Frank paused and looked at me with eyes full of sympathy and something that might have been admiration. I nodded, my heart aching with the memory of the good man I had lost, the man who had loved me enough to plan for my protection even from beyond the grave. Now, Frank continued, his voice taking on a graver tone, concerning my primary asset, the property at 121 Oakwood Lane, this house is not merely an asset, it is a testament to a lifetime of hard work, of love, of promises kept. It is my legacy to my family, and a legacy must be earned. He looked directly at Ethan, and I saw my son flinch as if he'd been struck. To my only son, Ethan Vance, I leave one final chance to prove his character. The room was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat, could hear the tick of the grandfather clock marking time like a countdown to judgment. Frank then read the clause that was Arthur's final, heartbreaking act of a father who loved his son but refused to be blinded by that love. Upon my death, the deed to the house at 121 Oakwood Lane is to be placed in a trust, administered by Frank McMillan. My son, Ethan, will inherit this house under one condition, that for a period of 5 years following my death, he demonstrates financial responsibility, shows genuine care for his mother's well-being, and treats Eleanor with the honor, respect, and love befitting a son. He must prove that he values family over money, that he can put another's needs before his own selfish desires. Brenda let out a small, strangled sound like a balloon slowly deflating. Ethan had gone completely still, his face white as paper. Frank wasn't finished. If, at any point during this 5-year period, he should attempt to remove Eleanor from her home against her will, coerce her into signing over property, place her in any care facility without her full and free consent, or otherwise treat her as a burden rather than as his mother, this inheritance clause becomes null and void. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. I could see the moment when the full implications hit them both. Ethan's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. Brenda gripped the edge of the table so hard her knuckles went white. Should this condition not be met, Frank read, his voice resonating in the silent room like the tolling of a funeral bell, the house and all property within are to be immediately liquidated. The proceeds will first be used to repay any outstanding debts owed to Eleanor Vance, as detailed in my personal ledger, including accrued interest calculated at 3% annually. He held up Arthur's journal, and I watched my son's eyes widen as he recognized his father's careful handwriting. After the debt is satisfied, the remainder of the estate is to be donated in its entirety to establish the Arthur Vance Memorial Carpentry Scholarship, a fund to help deserving young people learn honest trades and build something meaningful with their hands. Frank carefully folded the document and placed it back in the envelope. The silence in the room was so profound I could hear the hum of Brenda's expensive refrigerator, the ticking of the clock, the sound of dreams crashing to earth. Yesterday, Frank said, his professional calm never wavering but steel creeping into his voice, Ethan and his wife delivered a formal ultimatum to Eleanor, demanding she sign over her home or accept placement in a state-run facility. This constitutes a clear violation of the will's conditions. Therefore, the inheritance is void. As executor of the estate, I will be contacting a realtor this afternoon. You have 30 days to vacate the premises. The aftermath was not a storm, it was a slow, quiet collapse like a building falling in on itself one beam at a time. Brenda tried to fight it, of course. Her face cycled through shock, rage, disbelief, and finally a calculating coldness that told me everything I needed to know about her true character. "This is ridiculous," she spat, her polished facade finally cracking. "No court will uphold this. It's coercion, undue influence. Eleanor, you put him up to this, didn't you? This is some kind of twisted revenge." "Actually," Frank said mildly, pulling another document from his briefcase, "Arthur anticipated such challenges. The will was witnessed by 3 independent parties, including Dr. Morrison, who can testify to Arthur's mental competency right up until the end. There's also this." He placed a DVD on the table. "Arthur recorded a video statement explaining his reasoning. Would you like to watch it?" Brenda's lawyer, when she finally hired one, was a young, aggressive man who threatened to contest the will to declare Arthur of unsound mind to prove I had unduly influenced him. Frank simply sent him copies of Arthur's journal, the detailed, dated ledger of Ethan's broken promises and unpaid debts. The case was dropped within a week. They didn't speak to me for those 30 days. They moved through the house like ghosts, packing their lives into boxes with the mechanical precision of people in shock. I watched them take down their cold, abstract art and wrap up their expensive kitchen gadgets. It felt like watching an infection being cleansed from a wound. Ethan lost weight. I could see it in his face, the way his clothes hung loose on his frame. He looked like a man who had seen his future and found it wanting. Brenda, on the other hand, seemed to grow harder with each passing day, her movements sharp and angry, her voice when she spoke at all, bitter as winter wind. On the last day, as the moving truck was pulling away loaded with their belongings, Ethan stood on the front porch. He didn't look at me at first. Instead, he stared at Arthur's oak table, which was now the only piece of furniture left in the dining room. Everything else was gone, packed away or sold, leaving the house feeling hollow but somehow cleaner. "He knew," Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible. "All this time he knew what I was, what I'd become." I joined him on the porch, looking out at the yard Arthur had tended so carefully, the maple tree where Ethan had carved his initials as a boy, the flower beds that would need attention come spring. "No, Ethan," I said, my voice softer than I'd expected, tinged with the sadness of a mother watching her child finally grow up too late. "He knew what you could be. He left you a choice, a 5-year-long chance to become the man he always hoped you would be. You're the one who chose not to take it." He finally looked at me, and his eyes were filled with the hollow emptiness of a man who has just realized he has lost everything, not because of bad luck or circumstance, but because of the choices he made, the character he revealed when he thought no one was keeping score. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said, and for the first time in years I almost believed he meant it. "I'm sorry for all of it." But sorry doesn't rebuild burned bridges. Sorry doesn't undo years of casual cruelty and calculated selfishness. Sorry is just a word, and I had learned the hard way that actions matter more than words. I didn't sell the house right away. Frank had arranged for me to stay for as long as I needed, giving me time to process what had happened, to figure out what came next. I lived in it, alone and quiet, for 3 months. I took down Brenda's gray blinds and let the sun pour back in through the windows Arthur had installed with his own hands. I sat at the oak table and drank my tea from the china cups we'd received as wedding presents, feeling the spirit of my husband in the solid wood beneath my hands. But keeping the house would have been selfish, and Arthur had taught me better than that, so I did what the will instructed. I sold it to a young couple with 2 small children, a family that would fill it with laughter and love again. It was heartbreaking, but it was also liberating, like setting a bird free from a cage that had become too small. With the proceeds, I established the scholarship fund, working with the local trade school to create something Arthur would have been proud of. But I didn't just retire to some quiet corner to wait for my own ending. I took the $254,000, the debt my son had finally repaid from beyond the grave, and I started something new. I found a small, sunlit apartment in a community overlooking a park where children played and couples walked hand in hand. But more importantly, I rented a garage space and opened what I called the Second Chance Workshop. I hired 2 retired carpenters, friends of Arthur's who understood what we were trying to build. Together, we started offering free classes to anyone who wanted to learn. Single mothers trying to make ends meet, teenagers who'd given up on traditional school, elderly people who wanted to try something new. We taught them how to refinish old furniture, how to build a bookshelf, how to repair a broken chair. But we didn't just teach carpentry, we taught people that something broken could be made beautiful again, that something old and discarded could be given new life and purpose, that it's never too late to build something meaningful with your own 2 hands. One Saturday morning, almost a year later, I was showing a young single mother how to sand an old rocking chair when I looked up and saw a familiar figure standing in the doorway. He was thinner than I remembered, his hair graying at the temples, and his hands were calloused and stained with honest work. It was Ethan. He didn't ask for money, he didn't ask for forgiveness, he didn't make excuses or try to explain away what he'd done. He just stood there watching the scene before him with something I hadn't seen in his eyes for years, not entitlement or calculation, but a kind of wondering respect. "I got a job," he said quietly, his voice rough with emotions I couldn't quite identify. "Working for a framing crew downtown, construction. I'm starting at the bottom, learning the trade. It's hard work, honest work." "Yes," I said, not stopping my demonstration but acknowledging his words. "It is." "I see what Dad meant now," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of sandpaper against wood. "About building something real, about earning what you have instead of just taking it." I didn't rush to embrace him. I didn't tell him all was forgiven, that we could go back to being the family we'd never really been. Some things can't be unbroken, some trust can't be rebuilt with words alone. But I pointed to a pile of scrap wood in the corner, pieces left over from other projects, rough and unshaped but full of potential. "The first lesson," I said, "is learning how to make a simple dovetail joint. It's harder than it looks, but once you master it, you can build almost anything. The tools are over there, class starts in 5 minutes." He looked at me for a long moment, and I saw something in his eyes I hadn't seen since he was a little boy, not entitlement or greed, but a fragile, hesitant hope. The hope that maybe it wasn't too late, that maybe he could still become someone his father would have been proud of. He nodded, walked over to the workbench, and for the first time in his adult life, he picked up a tool with the intention of building something rather than tearing it down. I don't know if he will ever fully repair what he broke between us. Trust, once shattered, is harder to rebuild than any piece of furniture, but he is finally trying to repair himself, and that, I realize now, was Arthur's true legacy. Not a house or money or possessions, but a final, desperate, loving attempt to give his son a blueprint for how to rebuild his own soul. If you have ever been faced with an impossible choice, if you have ever been made to feel like a liability in your own life, remember this: the most powerful will is not the one written on paper. It's the will to honor yourself, to stand up for your worth, even when those who should love you most refuse to see it. Sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't what someone leaves you, it's the lesson you learn after you've lost everything else. And sometimes, just sometimes, that lesson is worth more than any house could ever be. If this story touched you as much as it did us, then don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment.